Good evening. My name is Alan Katz, and I'm delighted to see you here for tonight's panel, The Rise of Anti-Semitism on the Left and the Right. This program is the second in the American Public Square series on race and identity. It is also the first time we have had a program in over a year where we've had people in the audience. We appreciate the fact that everyone here is vaccinated, wearing a mask, and social distancing. We hope that soon we'll be able to fill this auditorium with people. And for those of you who are watching this virtually, we are happy to bring.
So there's a particular form of anti-Semitism that is called white nationalism. And it has its genesis in the victory of the 1960s civil rights movement. Here you have society had been socialized
Society's most perplexing issues. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions and fact checks from the audience. For our audience members in person, you can find a question and fact sheet inside your program booklet. When you have a question or fact sheet, please write it on the sheet and hold it up. A volunteer will come by to collect it for our roving reporter. Tonight's roving reporter is Vicki Diaz Camacho, community reporter with Flatland KC and project manager with Curious KC. For those of you watching virtually, please type your question or fact checks in the chat feature on your screen. If you have a fact check, please specify it is a fact check. Tonight's fact sheet, which is quite extensive, was produced in collaboration with our partners and panelists. This fact sheet and our live fact checkers were made possible with support from the William T. Kemper Foundation. Gabby Geller and Sarah Markowitz of JCRB and AJC will be our fact checkers this evening. Now, several members of the audience have civility bells. These will be rung if the tone of the conversation becomes less than civil. If you have one, just ring it right now. Anybody? Anybody have a bell to ring? Okay, I don't hear well, so hopefully you all can hear them. And finally, in the interest of keeping the conversation flowing, and of course civil, we ask that you not clap during the presentations. You're free to clap before and afterwards. And finally, now it's my privilege to introduce tonight's panel moderator, Dr. Ethan Katz. Dr. Katz is an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Someone asked me whether or not we were related. And I told them that the only way I can sort of answer that question is to tell a brief story. When I was ambassador to Portugal, there was a researcher from the Holocaust Museum in Washington who came over to the embassy and wanted to meet the ambassador, I was told. And this was not unusual, and I said, of course, she can come by. And so I made sure I had my coat on, my tie tied, because after all, I was the ambassador, and I was supposed to look like the ambassador. And she walked in, and I gave her my best ambassadorial smile, and she looked at me, and she said, "Are you really Ethan Katz's father?" And I assured her that I was, and I knew at that point that it was time for me to feel even more proud of my son for all that he's accomplished. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to our moderator, Ethan Katz, and I look forward to having a very enjoyable and interesting evening, and I want to thank all the panelists for taking the time and making the effort to be with us tonight.
For joining us. Thank you to my father for that very kind and generous and loving introduction. It's a bit of a heady experience to be introduced by your dad. So I'm delighted to be here to moderate tonight's program, though I wish the topic could be a different one. I frankly never imagined until recently that anti-Semitism would be such a live issue and such a clear and present danger in American life in my lifetime. But a variety of factors have converged in recent years that have reshaped the political landscape and brought anti-Semitism once more to the fore. These include fierce debates in American political life on issues of race and equality and conflict overseas, particularly in the Middle East. As a historian, I can't help but observe that, as in so many moments in the past that were wrought by dramatic change and societal grappling, in our own time, the position of Jews has become a flashpoint, and there has been an outsized focus on Jewish individuals, entities, and institutions from many quarters of American society. Indeed, it is well documented that there has been a significant spike in anti-Semitic incidents over the past several years. These have taken a range of forms, alarming trends of hate speech on social media platforms, social exclusion from groups and causes, verbal and physical attacks on individual Jews, vandalization of Jewish institutions, and in some cases, the murder of Jews for being Jewish. As you'll hear tonight, there is significant disagreement about the most important causes for this rise in anti-Semitism, as there is about where the greatest threats lie in terms of anti-Semitism today. There are even nuanced but important disagreements about how we define, identify, and combat anti-Semitism. Your fact sheet includes important background on both the contemporary rise of anti-Semitism and its long history. It also details some of the significant debates that are ongoing about the definition of anti-Semitism. But what is crucial to note is that, as always at events of American Public Square, all the panelists have had an ample opportunity to review the fact sheet. All have agreed that it provides a reasonable factual basis from which to launch our conversation. Now, as a scholar of the history of anti-Semitism and other exclusions, and as someone who oversees an anti-Semitism education initiative at Berkeley, I have the dubious privilege of participating in many conversations on this topic. So I can feel confident in telling you that you're in for an exceptional treat this evening. This panel is rare in the range of expertise and perspective that it includes. We have here a scholar, policymaker, journalist, and through remote technology, activist, all of whom are really at the forefront of questions and conversations about anti-Semitism in their field and line of work. In full disclosure, I should note that I'm excited to introduce all of tonight's panelists, not only because they bring such a wealth and diversity of experience and knowledge on this topic, but also because I'm lucky enough to consider them my friends. That doesn't mean, however, that if you go on for too long, I won't cut you off. So let me introduce them now. Beginning immediately to my right is Congressman Ted Deutch. Congressman Ted Deutch represents Florida's 22nd District, home to communities in northern Broward County and southeastern Palm Beach County in South Florida. He now serving in his 7th term in the 117th Congress and is chairman of the House Ethics Committee, a senior member of the House Judiciary Committee, and a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, on which he serves as the chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism Subcommittee. He's also served as a co-chair of the House Task Force on Anti-Semitism. Congressman Deutch has long been a leading voice in Washington for legislation to create greater awareness about anti-Semitism and to give institutions the necessary tools to fight anti-Semitism. Next to Congressman Deutch is Batya Ungar-Sargon. Batya is the deputy opinion editor of Newsweek and the former opinion editor of The Forward. I'm proud to say that she has a PhD from Berkeley as well. In her current job, she curates an opinion section devoted to radical diversity from across the political, racial, religious, and ideological spectrum. She's the co-host of Newsweek's debate podcast, and her book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, will be out in October of 2021. It includes an entire section on the way that wokeness distorts our understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a subject that she already addressed in a powerful column she wrote during the recent Gaza war. And at the far end of the panel is Professor Jonathan Judaken. Professor Judaken is the Spence L. Wilson Chair in the Humanities at Rhodes College. He's published more than 60 academic articles on the history of existentialism, anti-Semitism, racism, and post-Holocaust French Jewish thought. In addition, he has written, edited, or co-edited 6 books. He's the author of Jean-Paul Sartre and the Jewish Question, and most recently the co-editor of the Albert Memmi Reader. He's currently completing a monograph entitled Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, Confronting Modernity and Modern Judeophobia. And Professor Judaken has done more than any scholar I know to push the field of Jewish history and anti-Semitism studies to conceptualize anti-Semitism in a rigorous fashion. Now, as we all know, COVID-19 and the Delta variant have limited many of us in ways that seem to change daily. With that being said, Yavilla McCoy and Eric Ward are unfortunately unable to participate in person, but we will be hearing virtually from Eric Ward later in the program, so I'm going to introduce him as well. Eric Ward is a national expert on the relationship between hate violence and preserving democratic institutions, governance, and inclusive societies. Eric brings nearly 30 years of experience in community organizing and philanthropy to his role as senior fellow for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project and Western State Center's executive director. Since his civil rights career began in the late 1980s, Eric has worked with community groups, government and business leaders, and human rights advocates throughout the country to expose and counter white nationalist hate groups, protect vulnerable communities, and make our democracy more inclusive. So let's get into the conversation. Let's start with talking about a little bit of history that can provide important context for contemporary times. And I'm going to start with Jonathan, then we're going to cut to a clip from Eric, and then we're going to go to Batya. So Jonathan, how would you characterize anti-Semitism historically in the larger context of the history of exclusion and hatred and the struggle of minority religious and ethnic groups for equality? Put a little differently, what has anti-Semitism had in common historically with other hatreds or systems of prejudice, and what has made it distinctive?
Ethan, I'm glad we can start with the small question. I want to thank you for your kind introduction, and also so happy that we're having this important conversation. So a quick history lesson, really just a sketch about what's distinctive about Judeophobia and the ways in which it's entangled with other forms of exclusion. One of the things that's distinctive about it is the very long history of myths or tropes about Jews and Judaism. These began to coalesce in the 4th century BCE, but they really began to take off with the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, and they were most importantly articulated in the context of the New Testament gospel stories. So there you have, for example, the image of Judas, whose name would have evoked Judea, which is where the word Jew itself comes from. And he is, of course, represented as a traitor willing to sell out God for money. You have the representation of Caiaphas and the other Jewish leaders who are willing to do anything behind the scenes in order to preserve their power. You have the representation of Jews with being associated with diabolical evil in the course of the Passion narrative, culminating in phrases like Matthew 27:25 and John 8:44. And as a result of these myths, you ended up having, with the development of Christianity, the legal subordination of Jews under Christendom as it developed. With the rise of Islam, and for other theological reasons, you equally had the legal subordination of Jews. A really significant turning point in this history happens between the 11th and the 13th centuries with the Crusades, where for the first time you have the mass murder of Jews on the way to the liberation of the holy sites in Jerusalem that were under the stewardship of Muslims at the time. In the 14th and 15th century, you had the targeting of Jews in the context of the largest and most dynamic Jewish community in Europe at the time, in Spain, in the context of a religious and ethnic cleansing of the country as it was unified. And importantly, in the 15th century, targeting those recent Jews who had been converted and now were integrating into all facets of Christian society, you had the development of blood purity laws. In the 16th century, you had for the first time the coining of this new word, race, from the Spanish raza. And for me, as an intellectual historian, when you have a new word, it indicates that there's something new going on in the world at the time. And what was new in that moment was the development of the transatlantic slave system. In the 19th century, you have Europe beginning to, especially Central and Western Europe, beginning to break up into nation states. And at the same time beginning to gain global colonial domination of much of the rest of the world. And in that context, Jews were often defined as the other, the antithesis of whatever defined the nation and its values internally, at the same time that you had the development of colonial racism as the primary justification for the new imperial order. All of this reaches a crescendo in the context of the Nazi genocide. And I'm saying Nazi genocide here because we should understand that the Holocaust, the decimation of 6 million Jews, was part of a larger Nazi genocide that ended up killing just about as many non-Jews as it did Jews. The killing of Slavs, of the Sinti and Roma, commonly called the Gypsies, the killing of homosexuals, the targeting of the hereditarily ill or the handicapped. So you can see from this very long history that I've just very, very briefly sketched, that on the one hand, there are some elements that are distinctive about Judeophobia, but in all kinds of ways, it was in fact the scaffolding upon which Islamophobia and negrophobia and xenophobia all developed over the course of time.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think now we're going to go to a clip from Eric Ward that kind of works well with jumping off from what you just said.
So there is a particular form of anti-Semitism that is called white nationalism. And it has its genesis in the victory of the 1960s civil rights movement. Here you have Black folks, upon which this society had been socialized to see as inferior. But Black folks transformed the United States by overturning, right, a system of white supremacy. I'm not here to say white supremacy doesn't exist anymore. What I'm talking about is at that period in time, in the 1960s, white supremacy was the primary lens upon which we understood our world. White folks and Black folks, Latinos, and other people of color. Along comes the civil rights movement. It deconstructs white supremacy as the primary lens and opens up the possibility or the aspiration of a multiracial democracy. If you believed Black folks were inferior, it was going to be hard to believe that you lost to people you had been socialized to see as inferior. But it was such a significant shift in American history. Of course, those who felt that they had lost something, right, in segregation and Jim Crow, had to come up with a reason. So what they borrowed from was European anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews were conspiring to destroy white European Christendom through the takeover of politics, the economy, and the arts. The backlash that we see today is rooted in the backlash to that 1960 civil rights movement. It allowed these individuals to say, right, that they didn't lose to Black people, that they lost to a Jewish conspiracy. Why was that important? Because it allowed them to maintain their worldview of white superiority. You see, they didn't lose to Black people. That's impossible. They lost to this other conspiracy that is, in their eyes, supernatural by nature. That's why, if we understand white supremacy, a system of bias and a history of slavery, right, to be written on the paper of white supremacy, the idea that whites are superior, we have to understand that white nationalism, what we saw on January 6th, or over the last 4 years on the streets of America, is written on the paper of anti-Semitism. It positions Jews as a nefarious other.
Thanks to Eric. Batya, would you like to jump in now?
Sure. So I want to start by saying thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Ambassador Katz, to Denisha Snell, to Claire Bishop, to the whole team at American Public Square. I truly believe that what you do here is God's work, and I'm so deeply humbled to have been included in this program and to be on stage with you guys. And also thank you to the audience for coming out at this time. It's so great to be able to see people in person again. So I'm a journalist, I'm not a historian, so I know the question was about history, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see things, and then we can take it from there. So I want to start by saying something that I think is really important. I don't think anti-Semitism is the biggest threat facing America today. And I say that even though it is rising the way that Ethan pointed out. The truth is we are still the luckiest Jews to ever walk on planet Earth. And the only Jews who were luckier than us were us 5 years ago before it started to rise. So I think it's really important to point that out, to sort of contextualize this conversation. The reason I think this is an important conversation is both because it is rising and it must be addressed and must be dealt with, but also because it is a byproduct of what is the biggest problem in America today, which from my point of view is income inequality, encroaching oligarchy of the top 10%, and perhaps most importantly, the loss of the concept of the common good, of a diverse, multifaceted, multiracial, but cohesive nation. The loss of cohesion and the income inequality it has birthed has happened on both the left and the right, from the way I see it. Liberals have gotten more affluent, more coastal, more sequestered, and they have been leaning into a college-educated culture that views patriotism as, pretty lame and parochial, and they look down on people who don't have the same education as they do. And of course, those folks now return the favor, right? They feel abandoned and scorned. Donald Trump got a lot of votes from people who really had nothing to lose, who had this kind of let's burn it all down mentality. So with no common good or national cohesion binding us together, the right has descended into conspiracy theories, as Eric mentioned, and the left has embraced a moral panic around race. And again, the most immediate victims of these developments are not Jews, but working class Americans and those caught in intergenerational poverty, specifically the descendants of slaves. So this is why I say anti-Semitism is not the biggest threat. Jews are not suffering more than these people. But the new tolerance that educated Americans, that liberal Americans have for social discrimination against Jews and even violence against Jews reveals to me the deep problem that is also impacting the truly vulnerable among us. So for example, the fact that 41% of Baltimore high school students have a GPA of 1.0, okay? To me, that is a bigger problem than anti-Semitism in America today. The fact that Senator Tim Scott has been pulled over 18 times for driving while black, to me, that is a bigger problem than anti-Semitism today. And yet, there were over 100 violent attacks against Orthodox and Hasidic Jews in New York and New Jersey in 2018 and 2019. And almost worse than the violence was the fact that it was taboo to talk about it. Some of you might not even know that that happened because it just was not covered by the media. And so from my point of view, the same ideology that makes it necessary to paper over violent anti-Semitism that comes from the left, to my mind, is the same reason that Baltimore schools are failing. It's the reason we don't have police reform. The rise in anti-Semitism today on the left stems from an ideology that has enabled and given cover to income inequality. I call this wokeness, shorthand, and in many ways, it's the mirror image of the conspiracy theories that you see on the right. So we'll get all into that in a little bit, but to answer Ethan's question about how anti-Semitism stacks up against other racisms, I think Hannah Arendt got it right, and I agree with Jonathan here. Anti-Semitism is historically like other forms of prejudice in that it is deeply bound up with specific historic circumstances, class dynamics, and a population's relationship to the nation, the body politic, the idea of a cohesive community of equals, and whether you have that or you don't have that. And just as it is only through the ideals this nation was founded on that we will finally achieve equality for all Americans, that is the way you combat anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Batya. Congressman Deutch, do you want to jump in and respond to anything that's been said or offer any of your own thoughts?
Sure, I have some thoughts. First of all, thanks for inviting me. I'm really honored to participate in this really important conversation. I'm not a historian. I dare say I'm not an intellectual. I'm certainly not a journalist. I've enjoyed hearing you lay out this concept of anti-Semitism relative to other forms of racism and the place in our society. From where I sit, and I'll lay it out this way. I'm the founding co-chair of the bipartisan task force to combat anti-Semitism in the U.S. House of Representatives. We formed our task force to respond to what was happening in Europe, and could not have imagined, and I'll just finish with this and then I know you have more questions, could not have imagined that just a few short years later, we would be responding on a regular basis to the kinds of issues we're going to discuss here, to the violent attacks against the Jewish community in New York and in Muncie and Jersey City, and on the streets of Los Angeles and New York just this past May, and the deadliest attack on Jews in American history at Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. So I don't know whether this is unique. I don't know about the place, the historical context for what we're experiencing now, but I know that for the Jewish community that I engage with and talk to on a regular basis, there is real and I think justified fear about what's been happening in their lives, in the community, and how it impacts them, their children, and the future of American Jewry.
Thank you very much. So I think we've gotten a really great sort of panorama of perspectives on both historical context and the current moment and a variety of aspects that make it feel distinctive. And so let's dig a little bit down into what we think are the most critical factors and the most critical threats today. There have been a host of explanations offered for the visible resurgence of anti-Semitism today, from the emergence of white nationalism emboldened by the political rise of Donald Trump to the way that the politics of wokeness has manifested vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to the fading of Holocaust remembrance with time. So I'd like to hear from our panelists about why they think that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and where do the greatest threats reside. We're going to start by hearing from Eric Ward, and then I'm going to go to Congressman Deutch.
The greatest threat of anti-Semitism is our continual reluctance to admit that anti-Semitism exists, right? It makes us vulnerable to those who are using anti-Semitism to organize and build political power and reshape how we understand our world. Look, we should be clear, in the United States, white nationalists continue to be the main threat in terms of anti-Semitism, right? And its threat to American democracy, its threat to civil rights, its threats to racial justice in this country. And we have to understand that anti-Semitism is not merely a threat to the Jewish community, it's a threat to non-Jews as well. Many non-Jews have died from hate crimes, particularly mission-oriented hate crimes in this country, that have been driven by killers who believe that they're in a war, a battle with the Jewish community. We saw that in El Paso. We've seen that in Charleston. We saw that with the attack on the Sikh community in Wisconsin. But let's understand this. Anti-Semitism doesn't originate with the white nationalist movement. It originates within our society. And that means all of us on the right and the left are susceptible to anti-Semitism. The threat on the left from anti-Semitism is that it will split the civil rights community in this country, right? And leave us in the same shape that the Labour Party is in the UK. The Labour Party is deeply needed in the UK right now as it struggles with Brexit, right? And its own rise of conspiracy theories there. And it's weakened because it was not able to tackle the issue of anti-Semitism. That is a warning for us on the left, for liberals, It is time for us to take anti-Semitism seriously as well. People are depending on us to show leadership in this moment. And that means understanding that we are in a moment where democracy is under threat, and splitting the coalitions we need to speak to people's needs in this moment is simply irresponsible, and it's immoral.
I completely agree with both the need to speak powerfully and I believe morally about rising anti-Semitism, and in particular the need for us to recognize that we will not succeed in confronting anti-Semitism if we only see it among those we disagree with. And that's the big challenge right now. There are, I am a Democrat, and I can point to a whole host of examples in the Republican Party of statements made about the Rothschilds and George Soros, and classically anti-Semitic, either statements, dog whistles, but clearly with an intent to evoke the anti-Semitism that we've been talking about. And January 6th, as Eric points out, I think is a good example where literally we saw one of those insurrectionists wearing his anti-Semitism literally on his sleeve, on his body, on his clothes, and so that's easy, and I think important to point out. Likewise, though, if we're talking about the classic anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories, when it comes from those on the right, well, in Congress, likewise, when Democrats invoke anti-Semitic tropes, it's imperative that we call that out as well. And if you're talking about Rothschild and Soros and people, you're conjuring up the image of Jews. And Eric talked about the Labour Party in Britain, and we all remember that piece of artwork that Jeremy Corbyn defended, as I recall. Clearly anti-Semitic, again, all of the classic anti-Semitic tropes. If we talk about that, then we also, I think, have to acknowledge that when my colleague talks about those who benefit from things happening in Israel or from the pandemic, and you pull back the curtain, well, who's behind that curtain in that image other than Jews? We have to be clear that this is a problem, and that this kind of language it necessitates us coming together to confront it. And the reason, and I'll just finish with this, we're here in this really beautiful train station where there's an exhibit on Auschwitz, and there's a poll done, I think at the Claims Conference did a poll just within the past year or two that found that it was young people, millennials and Gen Z, as you probably know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was millennials and Gen Z, and more than 50% of them had never heard of Auschwitz. More than 60% of them had no idea that 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust, and over 10% believed that Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. So that's where young people are. And then this is an important conversation about anti-Semitism. American Jewish Committee just recently did a poll that showed that about 50% of the people in America either, one, had never heard the word anti-Semitism, or two, they had heard it, but they didn't really know what it means. We need to be just as serious about confronting the hatred of Jews, which is anti-Semitism. I know we're going to talk about definitions, we're going to talk about where it comes from, that's all really important. Fundamentally, it's about the hatred of Jews, and we need to clearly confront it together wherever it comes from, and educate our friends, neighbors, and importantly, the next generation about the threat that it poses not only to the Jewish community, but to our democratic ideals overall if we're not serious in this approach.
Thanks. Let me follow up with the other panelists. How would you distinguish between, Congressman Deutch highlighted this challenge of the fact that anti-Semitism, as the title of this program reminds us, is not limited to one side of the political spectrum. So how would you guys describe anti-Semitism on the left and the right? Are they mirror images of each other? Are they different in nature? How do you see that? First Batya and then Jonathan.
So first I want to tell you all that you were just very, very lucky because what you just witnessed was an act of political courage, which this country is sorely lacking in. The congressman just said that we have to be willing to call out people on our own side, and that is so rare, I can't even tell you. So it was really an honor to witness that, and I really appreciate it, and I hope everybody else does as well. So after saying that, I'm going to disagree a little bit. I feel a bit churlish about it. You know, yeah, there was one guy at January 6th with an anti-Semitic shirt, you know. And to me, the reason we're not in danger of becoming like Europe, like the UK, is because there is no buy-in from the American working class. We're just extremely lucky to live in a country that doesn't have 1,000 years of working class grievances against Jews. And I think a lot of people don't know what anti-Semitism is, especially uneducated people. I'm going to say something that maybe sounds naive, because it would never occur to them to hate Jews. We're just extremely, extremely lucky. And I think that when Eric says we're in danger of having the civil rights movement be split apart, it's very important to understand who's doing the splitting, okay? Who's introducing problematic tropes, problematic concepts about Jews into the civil rights movement. It's not the working class people who need the civil rights movement, okay? It's a new elite on the left. I'm gonna come back to this theme a few times. So I think to me the main difference between Marjorie Taylor Greene saying the Rothschilds have lasers in the sky and, you know, Ilhan Omar saying it's all about the Benjamins is that Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't know that the Rothschilds are Jewish. And when Donald Trump invokes George Soros, the working class people who he's talking to don't know that George Soros is Jewish. Now in Europe, when you say George Soros, you might as well say Jew. When Viktor Orban says George Soros, he is you know, their spidey sense for, you know, ooh, he's going to say something mean about Jews right now, right? That's what happens there. We don't have that here from what I can tell, from my analysis and understanding of America. We're just extremely lucky. I mean, I think there are a lot of historic reasons for that. So you have that educational difference, right? You have people who are very educated on the left who are introducing ideas that are problematic, as opposed to rubes on the right who, yes, sometimes they say anti-Semitic things, but it's just not coming from the same level of analysis. The other difference I will point out is that, you know, in 2018, two sort of famous people, or two invocations of anti-Semitism that were identical showed up. The idea that Jews controlled the slave trade, a classic anti-Semitic canard, it came up twice. It came up from the leaders of the Women's March. They had sort of invoked that idea, and it came up on 8chan, which is a sort of white supremacist message board in the wake of one of the shootings. 8chan has been shut down, and the woman who said it from the Women's March just cut an ad for Cadillac, the car company. So to me, that's sort of the main difference, is that anti-Semitism on the right is white supremacist. These people are reviled by society at large, and it's true, they are growing in influence. There's more of them. They got a big boost from, you know, they saw in Donald Trump a champion. They got power from that. They got a sense of, you know, empowerment from that, but they are reviled And even the January 6th riot was called out and denounced by every single Republican leader, except for Donald Trump. Whereas on the left, the people who are introducing these concepts that are sometimes anti-Semitic in nature, sometimes anti-Israel, sometimes leading to violence against Jews, they're heroes of the left, and their radical views are being very much mainstreamed. And it's being mainstreamed through this concept of this moral panic around race that ascribes to white people infinite amounts of power, and to people of color infinite amounts of powerlessness and no agency. They put Jews on the side of the white people, and therefore they have power. And this new movement, it sees powerlessness as the supreme virtue. So it elevates having less power as virtue. So we've abandoned this notion of morality. Is something true or is it not true? And instead we talk about how much power does the person saying it have. And to me, that is very dangerous because it has truly taken off and caught on in the mainstream. And that's sort of leading to the marginalization of Jews in many ways.
Can I jump in for 1 second, Jonathan? Just
Sure.
really
I know Jonathan has a lot he wants to say in response.
Yeah,
But go ahead.
just really quickly.
I have a lot I want to say.
So just two things really quickly. One, and I know we'll get into this more, and I know Jonathan's going to talk, can offer a much more thoughtful response than I'm about to. But just one, January 6th, it is, you can say, Batya, that there's been a repudiation of January 6th. But the number of my colleagues, again, I said we have to call it out on both sides. I didn't say that we can't respond when something is said about our opponents. We don't give them a pass, obviously. And on January 6th, you can talk about repudiating the insurrection, but the number of my colleagues who continue to advance the conspiracy, the dangerous conspiracy theory that the election was stolen, which is what in fact led to January 6th, that number has not diminished. So I just want to be clear about that point. And secondly, just to put on the table what is different now and what makes me really nervous when we talk about and I agree with you that for the majority of people, the thought of just waking up one day and deciding that they're anti-Semites, they don't know what the term is, that they hate Jews. No, it doesn't enter their thought process. But they're on Facebook and they're on Twitter and they're on social media and they're on TikTok, and they are being bombarded with, or certainly have available to them, a wide range of horrifically anti-Semitic posts that I fear contribute to this increase that I think contributes to this rise in anti-Semitism. That didn't exist before, and it risks, if we don't confront this now, corrupting some significant number of those who may not think about this at all, don't know what anti-Semitism is, don't know that people hate Jews, and then suddenly start seeing it pop up over and over and over again, and suddenly they internalize it. That's the concern I have. Sorry, Jonathan.
No problem. I want to build on what you're saying, actually, Congressman Deutch. I want to say a number of things about this issue. First of all, I want to say about the question itself, that in some ways, the question is a problem. And the question is a problem because what we are trying to think about in general is the issue of racism more broadly. And the bedrock of racism is thinking in stereotypes. When we talk about the left, and we talk about the right, and we talk about the Americans and the Europeans, we are speaking in stereotypes. We've got to always remember in these conversations that these are heterogeneous and differentiated groups. There isn't one group. So let's be specific about our language. When we talk about January 6th, there's not one person wearing anti-Semitic garb. There are a lot of people who were there also wearing QAnon garb. And this is obviously part of a conspiracy theory that is rooted in classic anti-Semitic stereotypes. When people talk about the Rothschilds, whether or not they know that they are Jews or not, when they talk about Soros, whether or not they know they are Jews or not, when they talk about globalists, whether there is a discourse that has a particular history. So one thing we want to understand is what exactly is going on with conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are oftentimes the language for people who don't have the analytic ability to name the real social causes that are creating a sense of malaise in their lives. And so what they reach for is a language and narratives that provide some kind of an explanation. That's what mythical thinking does. It provides an origin story for something that people don't understand. The notion that somehow the working class in America is immune from this kind of mythical thinking is mythical. It's a stereotype about the working class. And when we talk about who it was that has built up the base of support on the right, we should remember, first of all, that Donald Trump was elected with a very significant percentage of middle-class, white middle-class voters, including a significant percentage of white middle-class women, which was a surprise in the aftermath of the election. What exactly is going on there? It forces us to rethink what exactly we mean by the notion of white supremacy and the ways in which it works in the context of this country historically. With respect to the issue about the left and the right, and whether or not they mirror one another, I very much disagree with the notion that somehow these tropes are being generated by the left and then are being mainstreamed. They're historically, if we look at the patterns that have defined the left, and when I say the left here, what I'm talking about is the socialist, the communist, and the revolutionary left. Historically, the left has been defined by issues of economics. And here I completely agree with Batya that in a way, those central concerns have been lost and they ought to be reclaimed by the left, Democrats, progressives, and those further to the left, absolutely. But centrally for those people, it was economic concerns. And some of the ways in which they personalized those economic concerns were through the association of Jews and money that, again, has a long history that I already alluded to. On the right, it was primarily about issues of nationalism. Where we are now is that the socialism of fools sometimes meets up with the foolishness of populist nationalism, both of them, in fact, resorting to myths and stereotypes, mutually feeding one another. And I want to just say one last thing about this. This narrative that somehow America is different, it's unique. Today, in the context of the rise of globalization and in the context of the ways in which there's now a transnational spreading of these nefarious ideologies, we are no longer safe. That, for me, is how we end up with the Tree of Life in 2018 and Poway in 2019 and Jews being beaten on the streets of New York and New Jersey and in many other capitals, right? That is why that was such a wake-up call. Why, when you said this is actually a clear and present danger, it really is a clear and present danger. But it is connected to other clear and present dangers having to do with racism. We ought to be more woke, not less woke.
On that contentious note, let's go to Vicky, our roving reporter. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. So this one says, do people who invoke anti-Semitic tropes also tend to engage in misogynistic or nationalist rhetoric?
I mean, that's easy, yes.
And I'll just say quickly, just going back to my comments in the beginning, from my point of view, and I really am following Hannah Arendt here, it's an insufficiency of nationalism, of patriotism, of social cohesion, of a sense of what it means to be an American, something that unites us in a common good that is driving a lot of the rise in anti-Semitism and income inequality, which of course are related. So I would say, I'm sure some people who are anti-Semitic are also misogynistic and racist and, in other ways, but the nationalism that I'm looking for, that I feel that we've lost, that social cohesion, I would say, to me, it would be surprising to see those two together.
And I would just add that the Tree of Life shooter was, first of all, inspired by the Christchurch shooter, and chose to go to the Tree of Life synagogue because the week before, the Shabbat before, was Refugee Shabbat, sponsored by HIAS, by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. So in response to the question, look, it's a clear example of someone who committed this horrific murderous act against Jews because Jews were helping people of color. So that I think is the perfect example. And I know Eric, if he were here, would say the same thing. And I'm sure when we get to his next comments, hopefully we'll chime in as well.
Can I just elaborate just a little bit in terms of...
Quickly, yes.
So one of the things that historians and sociologists and scholars of stereotyping have clearly shown is that ultimately these things are in fact all linked. Misogyny and homophobia and xenophobia and Islamophobia and Judeophobia, they all participate, they all are rooted in thinking about the world from the perspective of myths or stereotypes or memes, learning to think about the world through very simplistic formulas about whole groups of people, okay? So the question is completely apropos, and again, I just want to double down on what I said before. As a result of that, what's required is for us to be more woke.
So now I have to double down very quickly. No, I have a relevant point, which is that I obviously totally disagree with that because, but I want to say why. To me, that's the intersectional approach, the idea that all oppressions are linked. And when I look at America, like for example, comparing the status of the gay community with the status of the Black community, like, I just think to link those two together is to erase the unique harm that was done to the descendants of slaves in this country that has never been righted. That is a huge crisis. It's a moral crisis. It's a crisis on many levels. And the idea that somehow that is linked with the fight for gay rights, which is really, really close to being completed from my point of view, I think that really does a disservice to the most vulnerable in this country, and that we need to focus on the problems where they are, and that intersectional language, it really distracts us from that, and it lets us off the hook from dealing with the real crises in this nation.
I have to say, there are still places in America where a gay couple can get married on Sunday and be fired on Monday, or can't find a place to stay because a hotel owner chooses to not rent a room
Close
to a gay.
To completed.
Right,
There are trans kids being killed.
right.
There are still gay kids being killed. I mean, we're a long way from being done in terms of gay rights struggles in this country or in this world.
And I look at it differently. That we can. There may be different different steps that need to be taken, and there may be more of them to reach the goal for different groups. I'm focused less on what we're all aspiring to, which is full equality and a representation, and more on the threats that we face as groups. And again, to the questioner, it's those threats that in so many ways bind groups together, and that we ought to be able to work together to combat.
Great question, because we all had so much to say about it.
So you're going to get to stick with some of these themes in our next segment. And I do want to say we're running a little short on time, so I want to urge our panelists to be a little bit more concise and crisp if possible. But as we're already alluding to, one of the hardest things to talk about with regard to contemporary anti-Semitism is the place of Jews today in America's wider racial and ethnic landscape. Of course, the issue of race today is highly charged. Anti-racism is a major and active movement in this country. And I'm wondering how you all see this issue. To what degree is it appropriate for European, Ashkenazic, white-skinned Jews to be seeing themselves and seen by others as, quote, privileged? What are problems with that view? I'm going to start with Jonathan, and then we're going to hear from Eric.
Well, I'm going to respond by not so much with the problems, but really with the issue of white Ashkenazi Jews like myself and their privilege. And I want to start off by talking a little bit about my own biography. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. The Jewish experience in South Africa was one characterized by the rise of Afrikaner nationalism, which was hostile and anti-Semitic in the 1930s and the 1940s. But nonetheless, Jews, like my own family, could not deny that they were unquestionably privileged as whites in South Africa. And what I want to say about that is that I think actually there are much more analogs between my experience and the experience of Jews in America. From the moment that Jews arrived on American shores, they were advantaged by their whiteness. When we hear the word privilege, which apparently is a divisive concept, or so we have heard in the context of the debates about critical race theory and divisive concepts, when we hear the term privilege, what we should hear is accumulated advantage. That is what privilege means. So it's of course the case that Jews in the United States experienced prejudice. They experienced even institutionalized discrimination in the form of being excluded from certain clubs and with quotas on Jews entering into certain colleges and even being able to enter into certain kinds of professions. But make no mistake about it, part of what advantaged Jews when they arrived here, part of their, what I call the passport of whiteness, that enabled their social mobility in America was the fact that they entered an America that was defined by a particular kind of racial order. And I just want to give you a very quick story that makes this very clear. Okay, there's a wonderful book and a documentary that's based on it called From Swastika to Jim Crow. And it tells the story of a whole number of professors from Germany who, in the context of the Aryanization of Germany, were forced to leave Germany and come to the United States, and they came to work in historically black colleges and universities. Now, for those Jews who had been kicked out of Nazi Germany coming to the Jim Crow South, it was clear to them that they were the benefactors of white privilege. And as a result of that, some of them became involved in the civil rights movement. To deny the notion that somehow Jews have not been advantaged as a result of whiteness in America would be as foolish as me, having grown up in apartheid South Africa, denying that somehow my family was not advantaged by our whiteness.
Thank you. I think we're going to get a helpfully different perspective from Eric, so let's jump to that.
Here's the point that I want folks to really listen to me carefully. I'm going to choose my words very carefully here. We have to understand that anti-Semitism, as it is primarily playing out, not the only ways it's playing out, but the primary way it's playing out in the US, that it is not a religious form of bigotry. It's a racialized form of bigotry. It doesn't see Jews as a religious other, but as a racial other. The next piece we must understand is that we cannot successfully confront racism or achieve racial justice in this society without simultaneously confronting anti-Semitism. It is because anti-Semitism is also a form of racism. But here's the twist. You also can't successfully confront anti-Semitism without also taking on the larger struggle against racism. That's the deal in terms of how anti-Semitism is largely constructed here in the US. But what makes this difficult is that anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily function in the same way that anti-Black racism functions. And so the comparisons to the two are not always very helpful, right? In truth, right? They each serve a different purpose. The purpose of anti-Semitism, right, is largely twofold. One is to create, right, a contemporary scapegoat in a society upon which society is allowed to project all of its anxieties and fears onto. But the second purpose is to use Jews as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots. That's not new. Anti-Semitism, that is a tactic that has been used in anti-Jewish bigotry for a long time, placing Jews as the buffers between the haves and the have-nots. And when the have-nots have become upset to a dire inequality, they're allowed to take their frustrations off on the Jewish community. This is why when we look at marginalized communities and we see that when we do the polling, there's a higher level of anti-Semitism in the polling. That's because anti-Semitism is functioning in the way that it was designed, right? It was designed to distract the most vulnerable in our society from achieving structural change by embracing conspiratorial theories about how the world functions. That is super dangerous. But there's one other point I want to make here. And I just want to say this. The hard part, right, is that whiteness is a fluid thing. There is no biological definition of race. It is a social construct. And that means whiteness has been always fluid. There is then the debate around where do Jews sit within the spectrum between Black and white? Are they people of color? Are they white? Are they other? Well, it just depends what society decides, because let's be clear here. No one but our structure of bigotry actually defines who we are when it comes to race. Society defines us. We don't define it. And largely, while in this society, right, America sees Jews as white, right? They're seen as temporal white, right? At best. I want to be clear that white people, right, for the most part, don't worry about their houses of worship being attacked, right, of being targeted, right? White people didn't have to build their own ethnic hospitals and social clubs, right, as a permanent status because they were allowed to assimilate in society, right? So we have to understand, if Jews have been treated like white, it's been like a other white. And like all anti-Semitism, it places Jews in a position of never feeling secure. And in the United States, Jews debate whiteness so much because I think everyone understands that it's temporal. And everyone understands, right, that it is usually at the moment where the Jewish community feels most assimilated that the rise of anti-Semitism has become strongest. And that's why we all have to be aware. Look, we have to have discussions around privilege, right? What's the difference between privilege and strong network? We have to continue to deepen our work around race. But the real conversation isn't around whether Jews are white or not right now. The real question is, how is anti-Semitism being used to undermine democracy and democratic practice that has secured gains in racial and gender equity in our society?
I know that our panelists probably have more thoughts on this, but I want to make sure we get to our last segment. Before we do that, let's touch base with our fact checkers, Gavi or Sarah, to see if we have any fact checks that we need to be aware of. I'm going to take that as a no. Oh, sorry, I can't see anybody.
Yeah, that Batya said there was just one person with an anti-Semitic saying on his T-shirt on January 6th. Several online viewers believe they saw more. Any info? She is correct that there was one person with a Camp Auschwitz shirt. However, there was additional anti-Semitism at display on January 6th. For example, there were people giving Nazi salutes, there were tattoos of neo-Nazi groups present, there were flags of neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups present, and as Dr. Judaken said again, QAnon is inherently an anti-Semitic movement, as is white nationalism, and so it should be considered that anti-Semitism was extremely prevalent at that event.
So I'm just going to have to disagree really quickly with that. I think the idea that QAnon is an inherently anti-Semitic group is very much up for debate. I think there are two sides to that. Obviously, there are certain elements that can be interpreted that way, but I disagree with that as a large, totalizing characterization of the movement. I am not a QAnon person. I don't support the movement. I think it's crazy. But I disagree with the characterization of it as inherently anti-Semitic. I think that that is actually a political and propagandist move more than it is one based in reality, having read a lot of the materials.
Vicky, do we have any additional questions from the audience?
Yes, Ethan, we have a couple questions. The first one is, if we seriously addressed income inequality or reduced it significantly, would we see fewer acts of anti-Semitic violence? And a similar question was looking for solutions. What is the solution other than naming anti-Semitic acts? The second is, you say that 50 to 60% of millennials haven't heard of the Holocaust. Why is that, and how can we change that?
So I invite our panelists to, if you want to choose, you don't have to try to answer all three of those.
I'll just take the income inequality one really quickly because I know you want to move on. My argument is that the main problem with America is this breakdown of social cohesion. The most important thing that has stemmed from that is the disgusting income inequality in this country and the rise of a new oligarchy. The top 10% control most of not just the economic flow in this country, not just most of the GDP, but like 90% of the political power as well. So that is really, really dangerous for our democracy, and that has resulted in huge amounts of income inequality, as well as people being allowed to use woke language in order to avoid dealing with the real problems that hurt the most vulnerable. Now, I think anti-Semitism is a byproduct of that same lack of social cohesion and the rise of race consciousness, the rise of an obsession with race that makes us ask of every single person, how much white privilege do you have, so that we can decide whether you're on the good side or the bad side. So to me, those things are very much connected, and I believe that if we found within us the social cohesion to solve the income inequality, it will mean that we will have stopped doing the thing that has led to the rise of anti-Semitism on the left, although I don't know how, the causal relation is not exactly one-to-one, if that makes sense.
When we returned from Poland after marking the anniversary of the liberation, 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, we passed the Never Again Education Act in Congress to provide more funding for Holocaust education. That's a part of it, but I just would add that it's not just recounting what happened in Auschwitz and the death of the murder of 6 million Jews, the attempted eradication of the entire Jewish people. It's understanding that it means something more to everyone, that in 2021, there are still people invoking Hitler and Nazis literally every single day. And that's how we make it relevant, because it's the tie from what happened during the Holocaust to the threats, not just to Jews, but to people throughout our society who are different and who are at risk, that I think we can make a difference there.
I just want to say 3 things about this. One is, for me, income inequality is only one aspect of what I would see as a kind of underlying cause. For me, the term that I would use is globalization. Globalization also means information technologies and new social media platforms, which I think are a huge factor in contributing to the rising of anti-Semitism, both on the left and on the right. A useful way to think about this is a book by a scholar named Benjamin Barber called Macworld versus Jihad. It was a book about globalization, and if we understand the title to mean Macworld representing the forces of globalization, McDonald's everywhere, and jihad being not only about the rise of militant Islamism, something we haven't spoken about at all, but yet another deadly contributor towards violent attacks on Jews globally. Jihad is also really about tribalism. So globalization has a shadow side to it, and that shadow side is tribalism. That's the first thing that I want to say. The second thing is Holocaust education. There may, in fact, be a paradox here with respect to Holocaust education, because on the one hand, people are obviously, younger people in particular, but people are deeply uninformed about it. On the other hand, there's been a massive amount of resources poured into Holocaust education, and there's been a process of the universalization of the Holocaust as the ultimate example of evil done by human beings towards other human beings. And this paradoxically may have certain unintended effects that play into a lot of what we are talking about. Things like it results in Holocaust denial, it results in Holocaust fatigue, and it results in the competition of victimhood, in which the ways in which people establish their victimization and oppression is through a hyperbolic discourse that insists that it's like the Holocaust, okay? And the third thing, again, that we haven't talked about at all, has to do with Israel and the ways in which Israel functions within the imaginary of both the left and the right. Because Israel is not only an ordinary country in the Middle East, it is also an imagined idea. And for the right, Israel has become a kind of idealized ethno-nationalist fortress state that is doing the right kinds of things in the ways in which it is defending itself against Arabs and Muslims and Islam. And on the left, Israel is sometimes spoken about in caricatured terms, as if it is the ultimate embodiment of a colonial racial state. These 3 factors, if you ask me, are the central underlying drivers of what is animating this global rise in anti-Semitism.
Thank you. I know we're running short on time, but we did get a little bit of a late start. And Jonathan's led us into what I think we have to talk a little bit about, at least, which is, of course, this question about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's certainly not altogether new that we have a live debate about where criticism of Israel spills over into anti-Semitism, but it is a particularly intense issue today. And so I want to give Batya and Congressman Deutch a chance to jump in and say, if you want to articulate where you think there maybe is a clear or semi-clear line between sharp critique of Israel that's within bounds and anti-Semitism, and if you think there's been a recent increase in rhetoric that crosses that line, how do we understand the cause of that increase? So I'll start with you, Batya.
Oh, I am much
Briefly.
more excited to hear what you have to say, Congressman.
I'm happy to. Look, first of all, I'm going to plead ignorance a bit, Jonathan, and maybe, I know we're short on time, maybe we can have this conversation later. I'm so uncomfortable with the reference to Israel as an imaginary idea. Because when we talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, it is the refusal on the part of so many to acknowledge that Israel is not an imaginary idea, that Israel is, in fact, the country where Jews are exercising, the one country in the world where Jews are exercising self-determination since the rebirth of the modern state of Israel in 1948, in a place where there has been continuous representation for thousands of years. And it's in fact those who choose to describe something that is exactly the opposite, that completely rewrites the history of the region, that ignores the longstanding connection of Jews to Israel, and that, to your point, suggests that only Israel, because it is a Jewish, and by the way, Jewish and democratic state of Israel. Let's be clear about that, because I don't want to hear from those who suggest that it's an ethno state. It's not an ethno state. There are equal rights in the state of Israel for Jews and Arabs, and there can be criticism of policies of the Israeli government, but it is those who demand that only the state of Israel, the one Jewish state in the world, has no right to exist. How does that not cross a line? How is it that to suggest that Israel and Israel alone, that the Jews and only the Jews should be forced to give up the one state that exists in the world? So when you talk about, when you characterize Israel in a way, and Zionism in a way that tries to undercut and calls into question the very right of the state to exist, then sure, then that's anti-Semitism. And I don't know if there's going to be time to go there or not, but I know we had talked earlier about how to define anti-Semitism, and this big debate about the definition established by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and we've spent so much time, it seems to me, trying to find ways to be uncomfortable. I don't do this, a lot of people in our community especially, trying to find ways to be uncomfortable with a definition that includes examples like the one I'm talking about, that makes very clear that they should be considered in the broader context of criticism of Israel, which, like any other country, is acceptable. That instead of accepting something that might actually help, because dozens of countries around the world are using it to try to understand these differences in places where they're not familiar with them at all, we're spending time trying to make it easier for those who want to play, often, I think, make it easier for those who want to suggest, as I said, that Israel has no right to exist. That is anti-Semitism. It's not one last thing, Ethan, it is not a speech code to say that that's anti-Semitism. People have the right in America to say whatever they want within very narrow constraints of the First Amendment. But I also have the right to call them out for it if they're saying something that is clearly anti-Semitic.
Thank you very much. I know Jonathan has strong feelings on this issue and also has a right to respond to what I think was perhaps a misunderstanding of one of his statements about the imagined Israel.
Yeah, thanks, and I hope it's okay if I jump in. So I was actually making precisely the point that you ended up elaborating, which is that we ought not to be thinking about Israel as a kind of imaginary space, but rather let's look concretely through a realistic lens at the realities on the ground, and let's do it in a comparative framework so that we think a little bit about, well, how does Israel look in comparison with when we talk about human rights issues with China, for example, or with any number of other kinds of states, right? So I did want to sort of say a couple more things about this issue about how do we draw lines between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, criticisms of Israel, and when they become anti-Semitic. So the fact sheet is actually really very helpful on this because it makes very clear that insofar as you invoke classic anti-Semitic tropes when you talk about Israel, it's anti-Semitism. So if you think that Jews, for example, have a double loyalty and that their loyalty is far more towards Israel than towards the states in which they live, it's anti-Semitism. If you think about Israel as inherently bloodthirsty, it's anti-Semitism, okay? Just take a look at what the fact sheet articulates about that issue. But you brought up the IHRA definition. And as one of the signers of the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, I want to say that if you haven't looked at it as a document, I would really encourage you to do so. Read it. Because one of the ways in which it's actually much more helpful than the IHRA definition is in saying what is not anti-Semitism. And you articulated some of that, right? One of the things that the JDA document says is if you engage in evidence-based criticisms of Israel, that is not anti-Semitism. And that means even if these are evidence-based criticisms of the founding of Israel, of its founding principles, of its major institutions, of its current practices and policies, including the practices and policies of what's going on in undemocratic Israel, the West Bank and in Gaza, which are under military occupation and have been under military occupation for more than 50 years, evidence-based criticism is not anti-Semitism. And the other thing that it says in there very clearly is that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is not anti-Semitic on its face. Now, all of these definitions are contextually specific, and we need to look very hard at the ways in which they operate, like the Occupy movement, and I'm very happy to have heard a lot of your advocacy for the rekindling of the Occupy movement. We need a new Occupy movement, and we need to think much harder about the 10% or the 1% who really control power in the economy in all kinds of ways. One of the things the BDS is like in terms of the Occupy movement is it's a completely decentralized movement, a nonviolent, human rights-based critique of the state of Israel. And so if you're going to just simply say on the face of it that it's anti-Semitic, that's wrong. There may be ways in which, in the specific ways it ends up being organized in specific campaigns, that you could make that argument, but on its surface, it's not anti-Semitic.
So I think American Public Square is never going to invite me back as a moderator because I've let our time go way over. but I felt that this was a really important part of the conversation. So I appreciate you indulging me. Batya, I don't know if you want to say a word about this before we move to now. So what? Now what?
Just one word? Or could I have 5?
You can have at least 5.
I'll say something really quick. In a way, I think it's the wrong question, because I think what I saw in May during the last sort of conflagration between Hamas and Israel was members of the squad taking to Congress to make speeches denouncing Israel. I didn't think any of the speeches were anti-Semitic, but I think that they did, I don't want to say lead to, but they were certainly connected to the pogroms we saw, people attacking Jews in the streets. So while what they were saying was not anti-Semitic, it led to physical attacks against Jews, indirectly, directly, however you want to think about that. So in a way, I'm not even sure that that's a very important question. From my point of view, anti-Zionism is not inherently, by definition, anti-Semitic, because I don't need Palestinians to want there to be a Jewish state. Like, it came at their expense, and they're not bigots for wishing that that had not happened. Right? That is an act of anti-Zionism on their part. They wish, the Jews had never come and established a state there. And I fail to see how that's an act of bigotry. It's opposition to a sovereign political nation. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that I really resent that, Israelis, especially Israeli leaders, often expect us to be out here in the diaspora, like defending them when they have the 17th most powerful army in the world, and they'll say things are anti-Semitic, that are anti-Zionist, that are opposition to the existence of a sovereign state. And yes, people could oppose that from a place of anti-Semitism, but the act itself is a political one. It's an act against a political entity. And one more thing, I just want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you respond. I disagree with the idea that only Israelis have self-determination. I have self-determination in this country. You have self-determination. You're our leader in this country. So the idea that Jews need it, I'm very glad Israel exists. And I think that our full self-determination in America, the reason the position of Jewish Americans and Black Americans is so different is in large part because of Israel, and I'm very glad it exists. But the idea that we are not fully self-realized or don't have full self-determination here, I think is a smear on the great state, the great country of America that I'm very glad to be a part of. Please tell me why I'm wrong.
I don't understand, quite frankly, how it's a smear on America for anyone in America to express the view that the fact that it's not a question of my self-determination in the land of Israel. It's a question of whether the Israelis exercising their self-determination in that land where Jews have lived for thousands of years is acceptable or not. And when you say we're just simply, all that's happening there is simply the questioning of a sovereign country, well, I would just respond, I'd respond 2 ways. One, we can have another conversation about where we can walk through history and we could talk about the founding of the modern state of Israel, and we could talk about the British Mandate, and we could talk about the partition plan, and we could talk about how the original partition, which in fact would have created a Palestinian state, which I believe today the Palestinians too deserve self-determination, which is why I so strongly support a two-state solution. But to say that, we'll do that another time, but to say that this is just questioning a sovereign state, I would ask, what other group in the world, what other country is there an active and ongoing effort to dismantle? Because when you say that the whole enterprise of the state of Israel is illegal, it's an illegal construct, then that is to say that it should be dismantled. And tell me another country where we look and say that the country has no right, that this group that has exercised its self-determination no longer has that right, and it must end. And I don't know what that is. And when the only place where that's happening is the one country that is majority Jewish, it doesn't require an imagination to understand
I have a
what's
great
happening.
answer for you. You're not going to like it, though.
Okay, really quick, Batya, because
Very
we are
quickly.
out of control in our overtime here.
Very quickly, these same people want to have an open border to America, which is effectively to dismantle the nation state of America.
I respectfully don't understand the comparison. There's which same people? I'm sorry. This is important. Which same people?
The same people in the anti-Zionist camp on the left believe there should be open borders to America, which is essentially to say they don't think that the country of America, the state of America, the nation state of America has a right to exist due to its racist past. They say this all the time.
Okay.
It's the same memes on social media.
I understand. What I don't, and I'll finish with this. What I don't.
Sorry.
There's a difference. There is a difference between Americans who are critiquing the founding of our country. There's no. If you're telling me that what they're really saying, forget about open borders. If you're telling me that anti-Zionists in America also support the dismantling of America, not through immigration, but through returning America only and fully to Native Americans, then I think that perhaps might be equivalent with the difference being a longer discussion about the founding of the State of Israel. But no one says that. No one around the world looks at the Irish and says, not good anymore. I don't like what's happening here. Ireland doesn't have a right to exist. No one does the same thing and says to the Latvians that we don't like this. I don't think Latvia has a right to exist. Putin, perhaps, with the an exception. So this is a really important conversation that I hope we can continue. But the really important point I want to leave behind is, as we have this discussion about anti-Semitism, which is what this is about, it's the reason it's so important is because of the threat that it poses to the Jewish community in America. And when there are those arguing Israel has no right to exist, at the very moment, as you point out, at the very moment back in May, when Hamas was launching thousands of rockets, Hamas terrorists were launching thousands of rockets with the intent of killing as many civilians as possible, that drives up the risk on Jews living in our country and around the world. That's why we saw people pulled out of a sushi restaurant in LA and beaten. It's why we saw people have fireworks launched at them in New York City. And it's why I think so many people came here and are tuning in, because we're really worried about it.
Thank you. We're going to have to move toward our conclusion. I don't know, Vicki, if you think there are any burning questions from the audience that you want to throw at our panelists before we move to So What Now What?
Yes, Ethan, we've received so many questions that I'm just going to focus on one, if that's all right. This one is, should anti-Semites be removed from platforms on social media or wherever such speech is heard? Should we openly argue against them?
Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I'm very uncomfortable with some tech oligarch making that decision about who gets to stay and who gets to go. I don't want anyone to be in charge of that. I don't want the government to be in charge of it. I don't want some tech guy to be in charge of it. I don't want someone he hires to be in charge of it. So to me, the big question is, who is making that call about what is, look, you got all these Jews here, none of us agree about what is anti-Semitism, right? So you're gonna have some guy in Silicon Valley making this decision about who to platform and who to deplatform? I mean, like, come on. I don't even trust this guy to do it.
I would just add, I also don't believe that we should give a free pass to those same social media executives in the form of total immunity for anything that appears on their sites at any moment. This is really, really hard. I agree, but we can't just simply sit back and say, well, all they're doing is providing a service, and if you want to be able to look at at your friends' pictures from their kids' bar mitzvah, then that means that someone else is going to be fed a constant stream of horrifically anti-Semitic images, memes, and statements. I don't think we should have to make that deal.
Yeah, I agree with Batya. This unquestionably concerns me, but at the same time, again, I think that social media platforms ultimately themselves, the people who control them need to get more woke. They need to figure out ways in which they can parse this without silly technocrats making stupid decisions about this, but in a nuanced kind of way. We unquestionably need to curtail the mechanisms by which you have the dissemination of these incredibly harmful racist ideas across these social media platforms, and it ought to be regulated more. And if they don't want the government to step in and to begin to legislate it, they need to do more internally to make sure that they're doing that themselves.
So I know that we could easily go on for a lot longer, but we've already run over time. So I am going to move toward our last segment. As you may know, it's a tradition at American Public Square to allow each panelist a final comment. And we do it in the form of a brief, and I will emphasize brief, response to each of two questions. So what and now what? We're going to start by hearing one last time from Eric Ward, and then we'll just move from my right to the other side of the stage.
So if you're Jewish, I'm not Jewish, but this is an ask, right? If you're Jewish, think about, prepare, practice to tell your stories of anti-Semitism. It's time to tell those stories from your youth, stories from your parents, or things you've experienced or witnessed, right? And it doesn't have to be on social media, right? Those are stories you should be telling your neighbors and your friends and other family members. It's important to begin to bring out just how prolific it is and how much it happens even unconsciously. So that's the first. For non-Jews, we have to make space for this and understand it strengthens our movement for racial justice. And we can make space by naming anti-Semitism. When we talk about racism, when we talk about other forms of racism like Islamophobia, right? The targeting of Muslims in this country is not just a religious form of bigotry. Like anti-Semitism, Muslims are also racialized. That's why Sikhs and Latinos often get targeted. And it's important to start naming these different forms of racism. The last is look, we need the federal government to really step up in this moment domestically. We really need national leadership that supports communities, supports schools in having a conversation on contemporary forms of racism and how they're being tapped into, right? To undercut democracy, to target minority communities, to wedge, right, local communities with political violence and through conspiracy theories. Communities can't do this on their own. It's a big assault on our communities, a big assault on democracy. And we need national leadership more than ever.
Deutch, so what and now what?
So the FBI just put out its hate crime statistics, and the story in virtually every media outlet that covered it was, number one, this dramatic increase in hate crimes against focused on targeting Black people, and the increase in attacks on the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and they were right to focus on that. The one publication that I saw that mentioned acts of anti-Semitism focused on the fact that there was a reduction from last year to this, notwithstanding that in May, from May of 21 back to May of 20, there are more than twice as many attacks on Jews. This despite the fact that almost 60%, and I'll tell you why this matters, this is the so what, almost 60% of the religiously motivated hate crimes were against the Jewish community, as tiny as it is, and overall, the second largest number of attacks against minority communities was against Jews. So what do we do? Now what? We realize, as Eric points out, that it's really important that we're having conversations together. Congress passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, Hate Crimes Act, after the horrific attacks on the Asian American community. Grace Meng, my colleague from New York, and I reached out to the White House, urging the White House to bring together everyone who will benefit from that law that now provides a greater focus on the impact of hate crimes. If we're going to combat anti-Semitism, we have to talk about it. We have to recognize, everyone has to recognize that this is not about oppression Olympics where we're trying to see who's got it worst. We have to acknowledge that the attacks, the hate crimes against blacks and against Jews and against Asians, and against Muslims, all matter, and we have to come together to fight them together. That's how we elevate the concern we have about anti-Semitism, by working together to fight it, and at the same time work with our friends across America to fight the other kinds of racial bigotry and hatred that exist as well.
Thank you. Batya, so what, now what?
So thank you again so much for having me. Thank you all for staying with us. I know we're over time. I'll be really quick. So from my point of view, the problem here is the lack of social cohesion and the breakdown of something that unites us as Americans. And to me, the way you fight anti-Semitism is by fighting that, is by finding people you disagree with and talking to them like they do at American Public Square. It's being a good person who someone who disagrees with everything you think can look at you and be like, I disagree with everything in that person's head, but I know they're a good person. And that very act is how social cohesion is formed. Find people you disagree with, be in community with them, resist the urge to dehumanize anybody, become a soldier in the war on dehumanization.
Thank you, Jonathan. So what, now what?
So I want to return our conversation to where it began, and that is the comments by Congressman Deutch, rightly applauded by Batya, basically saying that we've got to begin by calling this stuff out in our own tribes, in our own communities. If you hear people using tropes or stereotypes about Jews, if you are on the right and you hear people articulating conspiracy theories that are tinged with racism, call them out. If you are on the left and you hear people using classic anti-Semitic tropes, don't stutter too long in naming them, okay? Second thing is, know the tropes. If you're watching this online, please download the fact sheet and become informed about these enduring myths about Jews and power, Jews controlling the media, Jews being associated with evil. The third thing that I would say builds on what Eric Ward said in his concluding remarks, and that is all of us really need to expand our frames of reference. I think that it's really important that we think through these issues in a comparative kind of way. So if you are Jewish, learn in a deeper way about the history of Islamophobia. Learn more about the history of anti-Black racism. And likewise, if you are Black or if you are Muslim, learn more about the history of Judeophobia. And the last thing that I will say, again, is in agreement with Congressman Deutch. Ultimately, I think that anti-Semitism and all racisms are an index of the moral health of our society. I think this is what underlied what Batya was saying as well. And that ultimately, if we are going to struggle against all forms of dehumanizing others, the only way that we can do that is to struggle together in coalitions. And what that means is that we have got to extend our circle of empathy beyond our own groups, to understand the vulnerability and pain and suffering of those groups that have been racially stigmatized over the course of time.
Thank you all so much. I think that the fact that our audience has stuck with us for some extra time is evidence of the richness and importance of this conversation. So I would like you to join me in thanking all of our panelists for such an engaging discussion. And with that, I will turn things over to Claire.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Good evening. My name is Claire Bishop, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer at American Public Square at Jewell. It is also my profound privilege to close out tonight's program with a few very brief remarks, and I promise I will keep these brief because I know we've gone way over and people are probably ready to get out of their seats. First, I would like to express special appreciation to our partners in producing this event, JCRB, AJC of Kansas City, and the Jewish Federation of Kansas City. I would also like to recognize Kansas City PBS, the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, Union Station, Kansas City, Newsweek, and The Forward for the role they have played in planning, producing, and getting the word out about this event. Thank you to tonight's moderator, Dr. Ethan Katz, and to our esteemed panelists for this dynamic discussion that we've had this evening. Dynamic is maybe even an understatement for this discussion. This has been really something special. You guys, really appreciate you being here. We'd like to present our moderator and each of our panelists with an engraved civility bell, which we'll present after the program. We hope these bells come in handy as you seek to engage in civil, fact-based conversations at home, at work, and in the community. Special thanks also to our roving reporter, our fact checkers, our amazing APS volunteers, and our planning subcommittee, led by APS Program Committee Chair Ward Katz. Denisha also asked me to mention we have received an enormous amount of questions and fact checks related to this conversation, and we're going to do our best to address those in post-program content on the website, so we'll keep you posted there. Appreciation also goes to our sponsors for their incredible generosity in supporting this program. Without your support, programs such as these would not be possible in our community. A complete list of sponsors and partners for this program can be found in your program booklet. I'd like to voice my appreciation also to the extended APS team, including Ambassador Alan Katz, Denisha Snell, Alana Mueller, Lauren Weinhold, Cindy Johnston, Robin Smith, and Tricia Maxfield. Your commitment to the APS mission of strengthening community through civil discourse is a powerful force for change at a time when it is greatly needed. Thank you. Finally, to our live and virtual audience, my sincere gratitude to you for making the time for this important discussion. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to a short post-event survey. Please spend just a few minutes to complete this survey. We value your feedback, and we rely on it to plan our programs. Please consider joining APS for upcoming events, including Evening at the Square on October 5th, featuring award-winning authors Robert Putnam and Shaylin Romney Garrett. It is sure to be an evening to remember, and information can be found on our website, americanpublicsquare.org. Thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful night.
Change coming. I'm feeling a change coming.